Culinary Historians, Detroit Prohibition with Mickey Lyons.
We're going to talk a little bit about Prohibition specifically in Detroit, but also nationally during the 15 years that it was going on the last century, 1918 to 1933 in Michigan. So we'll talk a little bit about how we got to the point that as a country, as a nation, we decided that Prohibition was a good idea, and how we got to the point a few years later to decide that it wasn't such a good idea. So there's a whole lot of reasons behind Michigan and national prohibition. We're going to talk about a few of those. We need to look at sort of the context of drinking before Prohibition went into effect. So I'm going to start with a quote by a Captain Frederick Marryat, who traveled around the newly formed United States of America in the 18th century. And he said, "They say that the British cannot fix anything properly without a dinner, and I'm sure that the Americans can fix nothing without a drink. If you meet, you drink. If you make acquaintance, you drink. If you close a bargain, you drink. They drink because it's hot. They drink because it's cold. If successful in elections, they drink and rejoice. If not, they drink and swear. They begin to drink early in the morning. They leave off late at night. They commence it early in life, and they continue until they soon drop into the grave." So what Captain Marryat was talking about was the incredible American propensity for drinking. Before Prohibition started in the 1830s, the average American adult, and they considered anyone over 15 years of age an adult for this survey, the average American adult drank 88 bottles of whiskey a year. That is 3 times the current levels of drinking in America. So one of the myths, they say, is that Prohibition really didn't work. People were drinking more after Prohibition than they were before. That's actually not true. What Prohibition did was sort of counterintuitively made drinking a social adventure, as well as just something that the men did in the saloons by themselves. We'll talk a little bit about bar stools, strangely enough, and about how women came into the social space that was the saloons and the speakeasies and the bars as well. So it is not a coincidence at all that the 18th Amendment was followed very shortly by the 19th Amendment, which is the one that gave women the right to vote. Suffragettes and Prohibition and Temperance were tied very, very, very tightly together. So we are coming up on a couple of big anniversaries. Repeal Day, December 5th. And the first day of national prohibition, January 16th, will be 100 years old next month. So how did we get to the point where we decided drinking was so evil we had to ban it by constitutional amendment? Well, like I said, we drank a lot, a whole lot more. One of the reasons for this, of course, is that alcoholic beverages were cleaner. You know, the process that distills and ferments and brews beer also cleans the water. So it was safer to drink beer all day than it was to drink water all day. And they did. They drank beer and cider all day long. In the 18th and 19th centuries, church bells all over the country rang around 4 o'clock in the afternoon to announce grog time. And that was when everybody sat down, took a break, and had some grog around about 4 o'clock every day. Sort of early trial run for happy hour, I suppose. So I say we bring that back. For much of the 19th century, states all over the country start toying with the idea of banning alcohol at the state level. In fact, Michigan was around about halfway through when we got to our own final version of Prohibition in 1918. We had a few attempts at it. In fact, especially in Detroit, the state government, ever since the state was a state in 1837, was really, really trying to curb Detroit's drinking. The rural counties voted overwhelmingly in favor of Prohibition, and the cities, Detroit and Ann Arbor, voted what they call wet. So Detroiters, drinkers in Detroit did not want Prohibition, but there were enough people in the states that voted it in anyway. So in the 19th century, we see this series of groups called Washingtonian societies. We see people called the Cold Water Army that really bring to the forefront in the early advertisements the idea that any drinking at all is bad. So social drinking, not okay. Every Every drink you take is the next step towards death and despair. And there's a whole series of absolutely wonderfully cheesy piano songs, music for pianos, that are temperance songs. And one of my favorite titles, and I don't think I have the photo up here of it, is "Father is a Drunkard and Mother is Dead." So there's a happy little family sing-along song. So you have this advertisement. So it is the saloon or the home. It is drinking or wholesome family life. You cannot have both. So, and that in part is because so very many men were drinking their paychecks away, unfortunately. The saloon in the earlier days that we think of, especially in industrializing cities like Detroit, was very much the social center for especially these immigrant communities, and we're going to talk a little bit about how immigration impacted our decision to go for Prohibition as well. So the saloon was your bank, it was your social group. You went to get your paycheck cashed there conveniently enough. Sometimes you made it home with some of that left. It was also where you went to be told where to vote and who to vote for. So the political organizations in Detroit especially were very much centered around neighborhood bars. And the bar owners, we're going to talk about a couple of those too, the bar owners really held the power to tell their groups and their little communities who to vote for and when to vote. And in fact, they even took parties of people to the voting booth and voting stations from the bars. All right, so here we have the women who do not like the saloons. Understandably, domestic violence rates were 5 times higher before 1920 than they are now. In fact, than they were in 1935. So that is another thing that Prohibition did manage to achieve. So alcoholism rates were skyrocketed, domestic violence rates were off the charts, and the group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union stepped in. They were formed in Ohio in the 1870s, and they gained more and more power and prestige as they went along. They tied together the idea that women should get the vote along with we should vote away alcohol. So everyone knew it was only a matter of time before those two went in hand together. One tactic that the Women's Christian Temperance Union would do is they would stand in front of the saloons in hundreds, sometimes even as many as 10,000 women would march at one time. And they would stage themselves at the entrance to the saloon wearing all white dresses, because they're also suffragettes, and kneel in front of the entrance to the saloon so that the men have to walk through this group of women on their knees praying for these sinners. And it was a very effective way of publicly shaming people. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union gave us this mother or the saloon, the family or the bar. You cannot have both. This picture in the center, by the way, I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It's a spoof. This isn't really a group of suffragettes there. It's actually from one of Thomas Edison's early movies that is a satire on the kind of women that were for Prohibition. But they create this advertising campaign, letter writing campaign all over the country and in Michigan as well, forcing men to say, if you choose the saloon, you're choosing against family life. So here's another cartoon of the popular opinion of the women who were working for temperance here. Carrie Nation, of course, being one of the most famous examples. In fact, the WCTU kind of stepped away from Carrie Nation because her methods were so very outrageous. She was the one that would go into the saloon. She famously went into the Holly Hotel and smashed it up with an axe. She made her money by selling souvenir pins, and you can still find little Carrie Nation hatchet pins that people would wear in an antique store every once in a while. So here's some more of the advertisement of the time that is working. 3 10-cent drinks for a day for a year. It really does show how it can add up. And so this is, you have a nation of folks that are coming in and are coming into the U.S. from other countries, and they're unfortunately, the only exposure that they're having to the rest of American life is through the saloon and through the bars. So you get a whole lot of anti-immigrant sentiment at this time. So now, when the early efforts for Prohibition were starting out, really folks thought it was just going to be liquor that was made illegal. They really thought beer and wine were totally going to be okay. And in fact, all the way up until the national vote went through in Congress, a lot of folks did not read the bill and did not even realize that they were voting out any alcohol over 0.5% alcohol by volume. But one of the reasons that that beer and wine ended up being included in the Prohibition law is because it's the 1910s, 1914 to 1918. What's happening right now? Well, we hate the Germans. We hate the Germans a lot. And the Germans make and drink the beer. So all of a sudden, you have a whole nation full of people who is now equating patriotism with sobriety, patriotism with anti-beer. So we have the really pretty awful cartooning going on, but that really just goes to show you how these fears of immigrant communities. The Germans are scary at this time. All of the Eastern Europeans that are coming into Hamtramck in particular, but also the rest of Metro Detroit. Even the Italians, we don't like them because we just fought against them too. So we bring this idea that sobriety is patriotic. You are reserving money for war efforts. In fact, before World War I was over, the Congress passed a couple of acts to ban any kind of alcohol production that wasn't used for military purposes. So by the time Michigan goes dry in 1918, we already have effectively a ban on whiskey and alcohol to begin with, partly as a result of World War I. It is also no great coincidence that they wanted to make the map all white. So the fears of African Americans and people coming in from other countries really do start to bleed into all levels of society. So Michigan, like I said, got together and voted our own statewide prohibition starting on May 1st, 1918. We celebrated that 100-year anniversary last year. The rest of the country followed suit very quickly. It took 36 states to ratify the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, and that went into effect on January 16th, 1920. So Prohibition started almost exactly 100 years ago now. So what actually was illegal? So the things that were illegal under the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act were the manufacture, sale, or transport or purchase of alcoholic beverages. One thing that is conspicuously absent in the amendment is drinking. It was not illegal to drink alcohol during Prohibition. It was just illegal to move it or buy it or sell it or make it. So you have all these really weird examples. The Yale Club, Yale Alumni Club of Detroit managed to stockpile exactly enough alcohol in their basement to make it through Prohibition. So, of course, we also are conveniently located right across the river from Windsor, which at the time had 64 breweries and 17 distilleries, and also coincidentally was kind enough to end their national prohibition right before ours started. So we have access to all of the alcohol right across the Detroit River, Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie. So the area from Lake St. Clair down to Lake Erie was called the Detroit-Windsor Funnel. And at the time during Prohibition, it supplied 75% of the illegal alcohol that was transported into the states, was right through Detroit and Windsor. You've got a combination of very, very, very little enforcement. The Volstead Act didn't put a whole lot of thought into how Prohibition was going to be enforced. In fact, there were only about 1,300 national prohibition agents all over the country. That's probably not enough to handle Detroit, let alone the entire country. So it was something like every Every Prohibition agent averaged out had something like 600 miles of coastline that they had to guard. So it's obviously not a successful method for stopping criminal activity. There was also a whole lot of corruption going on. As a Detroit Prohibition agent, National Prohibition agent, you made about $1,800 a year, but you could make $500 on one day just by calling in sick at the right time for the right person and making sure that there was no one watching a particular area of the river. So within 6 months of Prohibition going into effect, more than half of the National Prohibition force had been fired for corruption and incompetence, up to and including the national director for Prohibition. So you can see how very well it worked, or didn't. One other thing that we should note is that the vast majority of the enforcement was not on the wealthy. It was on the poor and immigrant communities rather than the folks who were drinking at the Country Club and the Yale Club of Detroit. So it's very much enforced on the smaller home speakeasies, the home stills, the tiny little living rooms where the groups of people are getting together just to have a beer or two. So in Detroit, we've got a picture here. This is one of the very last. This was a different Prohibition in Michigan that had started earlier. But you have lines of people that are just lined up to get the very last opportunity to get some drinking in and to stockpile this. You also, the Detroit-Windsor Ferry becomes very, 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 very popular. In fact, it went back and forth across the river, taking about 500 or 600 people at a time every single hour of every single day, non-stop. During Prohibition, Detroit, the second most common job to have during Prohibition was to have some sort of activity with the illegal transport and smuggling of alcohol. So it was second only to the auto industry. It employed 50,000 people in the city of Detroit. So if you're, a lot of folks will say to me, my grandpa was in the Purple Gang, or, so-and-so used to run booze for the Purple Gang. Might not necessarily have been the Purple Gang, because we did have a few other gangs other than the Purple Gang here in Detroit. But if your granddad or grandma ran a speakeasy or did a little bit of smuggling on the side, that was not at all unusual. Everybody did a little bit, I think. In 1929 alone, it was responsible for $215 million economic impact on Detroit. And that is in to $1929, not in 2019 dollars. So you see folks going over to Canada and buying some booze, bringing it back. We did everything to smuggle booze in. We took boats, we took rowboats, we took speedboats. At one time when Prohibition started in Detroit, there were only 3 boats for the customs and Prohibition agents. Now, obviously, the illegal alcohol money is going to pay for a whole lot nicer boats. And in fact, in 1953, the former Windsor police lieutenant was interviewed about what it was like to be working the river during Prohibition. And he said, you'd get these guys that would come over in the morning in a rowboat, and they would get enough booze and smuggle it across the river that they could buy an outboard motor. So in the afternoon, they'd have an outboard motor on this, and they would take another trip, and they would get another shipment, and they would sell it, and then they would buy a speedboat by the very next day. So there's no way that national and international enforcement can keep up with this kind of thing. In fact, at one point, the entire fleet for the National Prohibition Office was stolen. So we have rampant smuggling going on. This same lieutenant talked about how the river was just dotted with boats everywhere you looked. And he saw it. The other convenient thing that Canada did, which was awfully nice of them, is they didn't require any proof of where you were heading with your shipment. So, and this is according to this, Carl Farrell is his name. He said, one day you'd see a fellow running across the river from Detroit in a small rowboat. He'd buy a couple of cases of liquor, row back. In a little while, he'd row back over to the Canadian side and buy 3 or 4 cases. Next day, when he came over, his boat would be powered with a shiny new outboard motor. He'd buy more liquor, make more trips. Then one day, he'd show up in a big speedboat. He'd keep making his trips, then suddenly disappear. Months later, he'd come back with his rowboat and start all over again. So he also says in Amherstburg, they'd take an old sedan, put chains on it, cut the top off of it, and load it up with whiskey. They crossed the ice of Lake Erie and carried planks to help them across creeks in the ice. It would be black with cars heading for the States. Highways all along the riverfront were just black with trucks selling liquor on the export docks. In fact, 1926 saw a massive rutabaga shortage in Canada because so many of the farmers didn't bother doing anything with their crops because they were making more money using the land to smuggle goods across the river. So rutabaga shortage was another consequence of Prohibition, unfortunately. So since you didn't have to declare exactly where the booze was going, you had this group of folks that would say, that would have fun trying to make the customs and export agents get their maps out and their atlases out. So you'd be over there in a rowboat with a case of whiskey, and they'd say, where are you heading? You can't say you're going to the United States because it's illegal. So you'd say, Cuba. I'm taking it to Cuba in my rowboat. Or they would say, oh yeah, I'm going to Madagascar today. All right, see you later this afternoon, John. Yep. So it was a farce, it was a joke, it was big business, and so of course with big business, we get big criminal activity. It is not at all an exaggeration to say that Prohibition was responsible for the rise of organized crime in America, especially here in Detroit as well. So this building here, unfortunately, is not still here, but it was one of the more famous swanky, nice nightclubs. It was also the site, it's now, if you're familiar with Detroit at all, it's at the corner of Woodward and Mack, so essentially where the Starbucks is right now, is the former site of the Stork Club. So very well-known site of a couple of gangland shootings because people were disputing territory. So now, of course, our big gang that we know of, this is alcohol being poured out of a saloon. So this is also not uncommon. You have the different kinds of speakeasies acting during Prohibition. So you have places like the Stork Club, the Anawa Club, private clubs, the Detroit Athletic Club. Technically didn't serve alcohol during Prohibition, but Cliff Bell set up speakeasy right next door to it, so you could basically pop over to Cliff Bell's place during your lunch break if you needed anything to drink. So you have either these higher-end places that have pretty good agreements worked out with the police and law enforcement, or you have more humble living rooms turned speakeasies. A lot of times, the local brewer was also hosting the local speakeasy. So enforcement is spotty at best. So we have down here on the lower right, that's an example of pretty common bar setup. So if you ever see an older building that has the door set at a 45-degree angle, it's likely that was a bar or a saloon. So here we have a few examples of some raids that the police conducted. Yeah. So this particular one was on Gratiot Street in Greektown now. I don't think the building is still there now. But they had a setup where they had basically a beer tap line running up through the side of the wall. They had a false wall, and then they cut into it, put tap lines all the way up to the second floor so that the bar owner, who was supposedly just serving either coffee or soda, could move aside a panel, open the tap, pour the beer, and close it back up and serve it. So that's how they managed to get all that beer up and out that window. So you have all sorts of new and innovative ways to avoid the police, including different groups of people, especially in the Detroit area. Most of the smuggling activity isn't happening downtown because that's much more well-populated and patrolled. Most of the activity that you're seeing in the Detroit area is on the east side, Grosse Pointe, St. Clair Shores, as well as the downriver area. Ecorse was infamous for smuggling because you've got a group of folks, what they called themselves after they were derogatorily called the Muskrat French. So this is a group of folks who has kept their culture and survived as a group of early French Detroiters So they have a whole lot of disdain for rules and laws. So these folks had already proven that they've got a very strong, tightly knit community on both sides of the river, and they've already got their little boats because they're fishing. So you have the Muskrat French really taking over a lot of the downriver criminal activity. But we also have some less savory crime going on here in Detroit. So we had a real problem in Detroit with criminal activity, with gangs. Show of hands, who's heard of the Purple Gang? Okay, most folks have heard of the Purple Gang. We had a few other criminal groups as well. So the Purple Gang were, for the most part, almost entirely made up of Eastern European Jewish folks. Second generation, their parents had come over from Eastern Europe and were extremely poor. Took over around the Hastings Street area, which is now where 375 is, unfortunately. But they took over, and these are the kids, so the sons of the grocers and the cleaners and dyers are taking over, as kids do, starting with petty crimes, and they ramp all the way up to a whole lot of criminal activity. Now, the Purple Gang themselves didn't bother making alcohol. There was no point. So home stilling and moonshining in Detroit especially really wasn't that big an activity because it was so much easier to just get it from Canada. Now, the Purple Gang themselves also didn't do a whole lot of the shipping because that's dangerous. You can get caught doing that. So instead, they shake down the folks that are doing the shipping. They commit kidnappings and hold people for ransom. They do that quite a lot. And they were kidnapping other criminal members. So they're preying on the other smaller petty criminals because they know that those folks are not going to go to the police. So they used this, and they started what was called in the 1920s and early 1920s was called the Cleaners and Dyers War. So the cleaners and dyers, fabric cleaners and dyers, and dry cleaners essentially were the way that the Purple Gang started to make most of their money was to shake them down for protection money. So they would say, if you don't pay us $10,000 a month, we will bomb your establishment. And they did. They followed through on it. So there was, for a while, a whole series of bombings. It was incredibly dangerous to have a dry cleaning shop because for some reason that's what the Purple Gang decided that they were going to target. So they did that. They made a lot of money. They stepped back from those bombings just a little bit, but still sort of had their hand in the shipment, the criminal activity. Now, of course, one of the most famous examples of this criminal activity that we see is the Jerry Buckley case. Now, we are at this point getting a little bit further in to the Depression era. It's not so much fun anymore. Criminal activity in July of 1930, there were 11 murders in the first 10 days in broad daylight in the middle of the street, including one young man. So young man named Arthur Mixum is essentially, he's a delivery boy. So he's got his horse cart and he's taking deliveries around the city and he's tossing a ball up in the air to himself. Well, it falls down and he goes to grab it from the door of a garage, happens to look under and see what is called a cutting plant. So the cutting plant is one way that the Purple Gang did a really good job of making the most money possible. So you would get your shipments of alcohol from Canada, of real Hiram Walker Canadian Club. But in order to make even more money out of it, it was selling for about $12 a bottle at the time. They would take that booze, dump it out, dilute it, put a whole lot of water in it, some coloring, some flavoring, maybe some ethyl alcohol, maybe some formaldehyde, maybe some few other additives in there, so that they're taking one bottle and then they're counterfeiting labels for a Canadian Club, and they're making essentially 5 bottles out of one. So there's some actual Canadian Club in there, but not a lot. So this is a cutting plant. So Arthur Mixum bends down to pick up his ball. He sees this going on and he realizes, oh no, I am not supposed to be seeing this. So he takes off running down the street, and horrified witnesses watch him get just completely gunned down. These guys come out of the cutting plant and gun him down in broad daylight. Now, Dozens of people witnessed this crime, but because A, he was African American, and B, it was the Purple Gang doing this, no one would step forth. So no one was ever prosecuted for this, unfortunately, but it was one of the cases that was so egregious, and people are really, really starting to get fed up with this. Now, so we're up to July of 1930 now. Jerry Buckley was a very well-known, very popular radio talk show host, and he would broadcast in the afternoon. And he was really, really anti-corruption. He was one of the few voices in the city against corruption in City Hall. Now, the mayor at this time was Charles Bowles, who was quite possibly the worst mayor in Detroit history, and that is saying quite a lot. He is the only mayor to have ever been recalled from office, believe it or not. So Charles Bowles got to City Hall with the backing of the KKK and with the understanding that he would allow the criminal activity of certain people to go on with no interruption or interference whatsoever. In fact, his office in City Hall looked out the window onto one of the biggest and most successful gambling bars in the entire city. So it's obviously Bowles is allowing corruption so long as he gets a cut of it. Jerry Buckley doesn't like this. So he's going on the air on his radio program and calling out all of these activities, and he starts naming names. Now, it was rumored, but I think this was probably just a smear campaign later on after the fact. It was rumored that he would call you up and say, if you don't give me money, I'm going to call your name out on the radio. We don't think that's actually the case. I don't think he actually did that because there's no evidence to see, that he had all this money coming in. So he's campaigning and he is petitioning for, let's get rid of this crime. And while he's doing this, the citizens are voting on recalling Bowles from office. Now, Jerry Buckley himself had said at the beginning, I don't think we should recall Bowles. It's not a democratic process. I don't think it's a good idea. The day of the recall election, on the air, Jerry Buckley changed his mind and said, kick him out. Get to the polls, kick him out of office. He's got to go. And he was finishing up after he finished up his radio broadcast, he often stayed at the LaSalle Hotel downtown in Detroit. So he had finished up his radio broadcast. He's sitting down in the lobby of the LaSalle Hotel at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and 3 men walk in from off of Woodward Avenue in front of dozens of people, pull guns, and shoot him to death, and then walk right back outside onto Woodward, unstopped. So now, obviously, this is a beloved public figure, murdered blatantly in public in the lobby of a nice hotel, and no one is getting arrested. So Bowles gets recalled that night. Jerry Buckley becomes the martyr for anti-corruption causes in Detroit, and we get Frank Lodge, who is a much, much, much better mayor than Bowles was. But this gives you some idea of how much and how rampant the criminal activity was going on. So this is the Purple Gang themselves in a police lineup. So ever so often there's a few bars in Detroit, and we'll talk about that in a minute as well. There are a few bars in Detroit that have this photo up there that used to be speakeasies. So what was it like to drink in Detroit during Prohibition? Again, it depended on who you were. If you were working the auto line, you were probably doing most of your drinking in someone's living room, in someone's neighborhood. One raid in 1927 in Hamtramck, which we'll talk about too, netted 8 speakeasies operating on a 1-block radius. It was everywhere. And most of these are very much small-scale operations. It's the keg of beer that they have, and you're pitching in money just to cover the costs of making the beer. It's so-and-so's got a couple of bottles of whiskey from when they went over to Canada. You've got those are small homes. You also have some bars that never really bothered to go along with the whole Prohibition thing. The one I mentioned before, the one in Greektown with the lines, the beer lines up the side of the wall. You also had, so as a doctor during Prohibition, you could prescribe whiskey. And they did for just about any ailment you can imagine, including pregnancy. And you could prescribe up to 1 pint every 10 days. So not really quite enough to get you drunk, but certainly enough to tide you over. So you see a lot of doctors and dentists operating speakeasies because I'm prescribing you this glass of whiskey right now. My doctor's consultant's fee is 50 cents. So it's technically legal because it's a prescription and you're not paying him for the drink, you're paying him for the fee. One other way that some folks got around the laws, especially in the saloons, in the working class saloons, was what they call the blind tiger rule. Now, blind tigers and blind pigs were called that because of a rule originally in Mississippi, but that other states also enacted, in that you could not sell alcohol, but you could give an alcoholic beverage as a gift if someone paid the 50 cents to see the blind tiger or the blind pig. So folks would also do this with a sandwich. There was one bar in particular, the bar itself is still standing, although it's been closed for about a year or so, a place called Tom's Tavern on 7 Mile in Wyoming. This was a shack of a building that is miraculously still standing. We're not quite sure how. But what they would do is Tom, the owner, would have a sandwich. And it was just one sandwich, and it was the same sandwich for many, many months at a time. And everybody ordered a sandwich and got a free shot of whiskey with it. Nobody ever actually ate the sandwich. You just passed the sandwich along. A lot of places did this as another way to get around and to operate essentially a saloon without breaking the law in that particular way. So we estimate that there were, the Detroit police chief estimated during Prohibition that there were about 15,000 speakeasies. That's about 10 times as many bars as there were. So because they were so much smaller and more centralized, there were so many more of them. Now you also had the higher end clubs as well, but for the most part, these are smaller places. So I've got a couple of different smuggling methods here that we used to get through Prohibition. There was one really great, clever technique. There was at the foot of Alter Street on the east side of Detroit, almost into Grosse Pointe. In fact, I think Alter is the borderline between Detroit and Grosse Pointe. There was a chain that went under the river all the way across to Pêche Island, which is technically a Canadian island. And you would attach a barrel on the Canadian side to that, a barrel of whiskey attached to that chain, and then a boat would come and move the chain down the river, essentially. So you are sending this barrel of whiskey under the river on this chain, and then somebody would just pop up on the other side of the river, unload it, send it back down, and good to go. A lot of incredibly ingenious methods and very, very, very lax enforcement. So one example I'm going to give you of a town in particular that really, really took it to the next level is Hamtramck. Now, Hamtramck was incorporated in 1922 as a city. And they actually, during the course of the 13 years of national prohibition, they sent 2 separate mayors to jail, to federal prison, because of the amount of illegal activity going on in the city. So it was absolutely out of control. There was one bar, saloon / brothel that was on the border of Detroit and Hamtramck. And in fact, the front room was in Detroit and the back room was in Hamtramck. So enforcement was always fun because if the Hamtramck police came in, you just went over to the Detroit side with your drink. And if the Detroit police came in, you went to the Hamtramck side with your drink. So at one point at this establishment called Patty McGraw's, which is unfortunately not there anymore either, the Hamtramck police were in there having a few drinks with their buddies, and Detroit police raided the place. They got into a brawl that spilled out into the street, and the Hamtramck officers arrested the Detroit officers, threw him in Hamtramck jail for 2 days until the chief of Detroit police had to come, convince the mayor, who didn't happen to be in prison at the time, to release them. And it really cemented some bad, bad blood between the two cities. Now, unfortunately, I don't happen to have a photo on here of Cliff Bell's, which is a storied bar in Detroit that the one that is there now didn't open until 1935, but it was Cliff Bell's fourth bar that he ran during Prohibition, so he made enough money running all of the other swanky speakeasies to build a very nice top-of-the-line jazz club. Now, one reason that Cliff Bell is significant, and we can't absolutely 100% prove this, but there are substantial rumors, and one that is actually repeated in Restaurant Supply magazine, of all things, that Cliff Bell invented the bar stool. So before Prohibition, women did not go to bars, or I should say ladies did not go to bars. If there was a woman in the bar, there was a pretty good chance that she was a prostitute, and that's why she was there. Otherwise, ladies drank genteelly in their own homes, not in the saloons. And again, a lot of these saloons are very, very divey places. You know, they've got sawdust on the floor, spittoons everywhere, and trenches alongside the bar so that the men can urinate without having to step away from the bar. Not a lot of women wanted to go into these places, truly. But once Prohibition comes along, all of a sudden, starting with the upper classes and trickling down, it becomes a lark to go out and have a drink in a speakeasy. So in addition to inventing, well, popularizing, I should say, the cocktail, because you need to mix a whole lot of different things with your rot gut whiskey to make it taste good, Prohibition revolutionized the way we socialize as a country. So these women, they don't want to be standing at the bar with their legs up on the brass rail. They need to be sitting. And so they start bringing the stools up to the bar itself. Prior to this, the bars never had stools in front of them. It was just tables or you stood at the rail. So you start seeing women going out first in groups, in mixed company on dates, which was also kind of a new phenomenon, thanks to Prohibition. But then you also start seeing them going to bars by themselves and sitting by themselves. And this is one of the very first times that we see women entering the public space, not for work, but just for pleasure and being by themselves at bars and it being totally okay. So we have Cliff Bell to thank for the bar stool and for women going to bars. Of course, once you get the women at the bars, they want the bars to become legal. So we have some protests. Now, it was obviously never as popular as they thought it would be. And straight from the beginning, we were, as a nation and as a city, we were protesting. So these are some of my favorite ones. So you start seeing, like this example with the soldiers here, or the sailors, you start seeing folks saying, it is patriotic to drink. We need the money for taxes. In fact, Prohibition was only made legal by the income tax. Prior to Prohibition, about 70% of the federal budget came from excises and liquor taxes. This was big money, big business. And then, so it became this, catch-22, because if you abolish alcohol, then you're losing all of this money for the federal government. Their solution to this problem was to invent the income tax. So we can thank them for that too. But you have these folks that are equating successful industry with drinking. It's patriotic. It is okay to drink a beer. It is a man's reward. So we've got a wonderful, wonderful level of cartooning going on here. I don't know if you can read it. It's the Amalgamated Order of Pretzels. So you start seeing these groups, and these more respectable groups, women in particular, we've got the vote now, and family people, middle-class citizens standing up and saying, you know what, I don't think beer's all that bad. So we have a national movement that starts in the same way organically as the temperance movement had started. We have it going back around the other side. We're also, of course, deep into the Depression by now, too. So Prohibition has brought gambling. It has brought illegal gangs it's brought an incredible, incredible amount of criminal activity and organized crime. And it really hasn't done a whole lot of good for anybody. The economy is doing terrible, so some folks start to say, well, if you let us make beer, we'll make more money. And more money makes everybody more happy. So we finally get enough people. Michigan was the very first state to vote for repeal. We were so very eager to vote for repeal that the governor came back from a business trip at the very last second and rushed together the delegates. So each county sent one delegate. 99 voted to repeal. One, Berry County, voted to keep Prohibition, so we obviously won. And people were so very excited that this was coming that they went ahead and went out into the streets and started drinking beer right away, well before the rest of the country had voted it in. So this here is actually Julius Stroh, so the heir to the Stroh's fortune, pouring the celebration beer, Detroit Victory Day, they say. So that was after it had become technically legal. So he poured this for a crowd of 50,000 people at the American Legion Hall. Detroit partied on that day. So Michigan's Repeal Day really is much more fun than the National Repeal Day, because by the time National Repeal Day came in a few months later on December 5th, we were already drinking. So there we are. We were already drinking. Just want to finish up with a few comments about what the aftermath of Prohibition was. So we have created, because of Prohibition, we have organized federal units like the FBI that come into effect because of Prohibition. We have national groups of law enforcement that we really hadn't had as much before Prohibition. We have the strange and Byzantine law system that is the Michigan Liquor Code, which if anyone has ever worked at a restaurant or a bar knows is absolutely incredibly difficult to navigate as well. Because after Prohibition ends, Michigan has to decide very specifically and very clearly how will we regulate the sale of alcohol. This is a significant and important decision to make, and they're in some ways starting from scratch. One negative consequence that they're trying to avoid when they're organizing and legislating the sale and transport of alcohol, they're trying to avoid what happened during Prohibition when you have these cutting operations and you have these bad poisoned moonshine that goes through. One thing that the federal government had done during Prohibition in order to try and stem the tide of people that are moonshining and drinking is that they would seize shipments and then poison them and then put them back out into production. We estimate that over the course of Prohibition, more than 10,000 people died as a result of ingesting alcohol poisoned by the federal government. So Michigan steps in and says, well, that wasn't a good idea. We don't want that to happen. But we also don't want it to be the Wild West here. So we have an incredibly Byzantine set of laws that were designed in 1933 and have only been changed and added to over the years. And I wrote about this in the Detroit Metro Times, one of the laws that went into effect after Prohibition ended was Michigan and the federal government deciding how to tax alcohol. And in some ways, they decided that it was by volume. So the big guys get taxed more so that the small guys can, the small businessmen can have an easier time of it. So until just 2 years ago, the federal tax on a on a gallon of distilled spirits from a group that made fewer than 100,000 cases a year was $13. Congress passed an act 2 years ago that was effective for 2 years, so until December 31st, 2019, that dropped that tax to $2.70. So for the last 2 years, it's been a lot less expensive to make and sell distilled spirits. But that only goes until the end of the year. So Congress actually needs to decide whether to repass this and make it permanent, or we're going to see a whole lot of changes in the way that we drink alcohol around here because it's going to become extremely expensive to produce it. So that really hurts the little guy a lot more than it hurts, say Smirnoff. They're not going to care as much. They're built that cost into it. So we have these kinds of repercussions from Prohibition and our attempt to legislate morality, essentially. We're starting to see echoes of that in the medical marijuana and the recreational marijuana debate as well. And we're actually going through a very similar thing right now as a state as we're legislating this and trying to figure out where it can be done, where it's legal, how it's legal, as we did 100 years ago when we were doing the same thing with alcohol. Let's hope this one works a little bit more smoothly than the last one did. So that is it. I do have some time for questions if anyone has any questions. Yes?
I used to hear from my father that his father made wine in the basement during Prohibition because they were Jewish. He said they could do it for religious reasons.
Yes. I'm really glad that you asked that one because I love this story. It was legal for clergy and rabbis to make wine. Well, he could have said he was, and in fact, rabbis in particular, because it didn't require, say a Catholic priest has to go to a seminary, rabbis, they could just say, I am a rabbi, therefore. So the number of rabbis in Detroit during Prohibition grew by tenfold, exponentially. There were 10 times more rabbis in Detroit in 1918 than there were in 1917. And it was very common, and it got to be so absurd and so outrageous that grocers would sell grape concentrate in a can with a very large label on it that said, warning, do not leave unattended in a cool, dark place for 6 weeks, or this will become alcoholic wine. And that was it. That's the directions on the warning label. That's all you needed. So there were, as Michigan becomes increasingly hysterical in its attempts to legislate this and to stop this, Michigan passed a bill making possession of anything, like a pint, a felony. And your third offense was an automatic life sentence. So we had a fellow named Fred Palms who went to jail for life because he had a pint of gin in his pocket when the police raided his house. So he was, of course, released eventually, but it still took until 1934 or 1935 for him to get out of jail. Again, echoes of the current situation that's going on with marijuana being legal, but people still being in jail because it was illegal when they were arrested. So yeah, one of the other things with the wine industry is that Michigan passed a law requiring grocers to ascertain that their customers were not using the grapes that they bought to make wine. I mean, who wants to do this? And these poor grocers are absolutely appalled. I'm going to interview every one of my customers. What are you using these grapes for? No, it's not my responsibility. So yeah, it was quite common, actually, because wine was easiest out of almost everything to make, because again, you could just buy the can of concentrate. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? All right. Well, I thank you for your time.
This program was recorded on November 17th, 2019, at the Ann Arbor District Library.